Hello, my name's Emily Day. I'm from Footprint, and today we're here with Tim Downs, who's a Development Director at British Land, and Nick Jackson, the Director at Arup, to talk about One Triton Square, which is a building where they've been able to reuse the existing building and as a result cut the amount of carbon in the site over the next 20 years. So I think probably start with you, Tim, if you can set the scene a little bit for us about the project. It wasn't originally a project where carbon was the main aim of the game. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about the context, about the campus there and the building itself.
So One Triton is set in Regent's Place, which is a campus, mixed-use campus that British Land has owned for over 30 years now. We developed One Triton ourselves back in the late 90s, so it's already a 20-year-old building. Helpfully, we knew a lot about the building in the first place because we had very good records of it, and we've been managing it for the last 20 years. Our initial point of call when looking at reinventing a site or reimagining what's going to happen next when a building reaches the end of its useful life is to look at all the options, including new build. But quite quickly, we got to a point where we knew the development constraints on the building. It sits within one of London's viewing corridors, so we could only increase the height by 3 floors, and it was obvious that economically it wasn't going to stand up as a new build. So we looked at what we could do with reusing the existing structure. And
you were in touch with the original design team, Arup, who were involved in the project from the outset in the 1990s. So that was quite helpful, was it, in terms of pulling together all of the information that you needed to look at the existing building?
It was extremely helpful. We didn't hesitate to reappoint Arup and bring the Arup team back into the project fold. And actually, we then, later in the project, but still relatively early on, brought in Lend-Lease, who were the original contractors on the project. So in some respects, it was a bit like getting the band back together, and we had a very collegiate approach between the team, and lots of existing knowledge that was extremely helpful.
How did British Land's commitment to carbon zero, British Land are committed to carbon zero by 2030 across their portfolio, how did that influence the beginning stages of the project? Did it form part of the process which made you decide to rebuild the existing building rather than to knock it down and start again?
Our 2030 strategy forms one of the main rungs of our business at the moment, but actually the One Triton project was one of the influences of that strategy. So in making the carbon savings that we've made on the One Triton project, we've actually used that to influence other projects going forwards and help form that strategy.
Can you tell me, looking at the building from the beginning, what you decided to do with it?
Well, the starting point really in terms of thinking of what to do with the building was understand what we designed the first time round. And the original building was designed for pretty intensive use as a trading building for a bank, for an American bank. So it had, great bones, great sort of resilient capacity in terms of, the sort of benchmarks we use, means of escape, capacity, air volume and so on. The other part of it was it therefore had a very good structure, which had very high capacity and loading because it had been designed for higher loadings. And actually for its time, it had probably one of the earliest double skin facades that now is sort of where we see the cutting edge of designing envelopes. At the time, it had a double skin facade that meant actually environmentally it performed very well.
Can you explain, for people who don't know, what you mean by double skin facade?
So it had an inner 2 layers of glass separated by about 1 metre. The inner layer is double glazed and the outer layer is single glazed, and that works as a very good envelope for tempering solar gain and insulating the building, which are the 2 things you're trying to do for a fully glazed building. And that meant when we came to revisit the facades and what to do with them, actually it was easier than it might be with another building of that age to upgrade it to a higher sort of modern spec and performance. And the same went for things like the staircases and the structure particularly.
What were the objectives that you were set by your client to what you were looking to achieve with the building design overall?
The 2 parts to that, I guess, were first of all we had to achieve a sort of quantum of floor area. If we didn't achieve the increase in volume, then the building wasn't going to make commercial sense to redevelop in the way we did. So that meant looking at how many stories we could get on, economically and viably, with bearing in mind it had a huge amount of basement space underneath that was part of the sort of main servicing system of the whole estate. And then the second part of it would be looking at whether that could be done economically and where it sat environmentally with respect to BREEAM. But at the outset, as Tim's explained, we weren't really focusing on the carbon side of that. That emerged as the strategy for the best approach to the redesign. It sort of emerged.
So the final design sort of adds, well, 3 floors, creates additional floor space though through a few other sort of clever techniques.
Yeah, well, the floor space is primarily the building pushes out on the southeast corner to reconnect it to the main square, the plaza at the centre of Regent's Place, which the old building sort of withdrew from. And it's reconfigured certain areas of the ground floor to make those usable that weren't before. We took away a passage that ran through the building. And then the other things we did, the sort of the nuance or the clever things we did, we managed to increase the floor area without increasing the plant area. So we lifted the plant up a story, but it's basically the same area of plant. And we did things like we reduced heating from heating staircases and things.
It's probably worth also saying that the original atrium within the building was 36 metres by 36, octagonal shaped, very specific for the original occupier who it was built bespokely for. And we were able to reduce that by half to 18 by 18. Yeah. Still a massive atrium, which plays a big part in the incoming occupier's circulation strategy, but also clawed back an awful lot of area.
And talking about the occupier, I think that they came on board quite early on in the process in terms of having taken a confirmed let on the building. Did that allow you to do things that you might not have been able to do if you were working a bit more prospectively?
Yeah, it did. And once you get an occupier on board, that gives everyone confidence. That gives the design team confidence. It gives the developer huge confidence from a financial perspective. And it gives the contractor confidence. And what that meant was that the design team, the contractor and the developer, and working with our incoming customer, Dentsu, we were all able to come together, and it created a great deal of momentum with the project, and everyone was fully committed from the start.
We've talked earlier about neighbours and the way in which we've got to understand the way that buildings work when they're actually in use. You told me that you were able to, with your track record on the building, understand better than you would do with a new build and make predictions about how the old building worked and how the new building would work. But were you also able to work with the occupier to come up with strategies for how they were going to actually ultimately use the building?
Yes, I mean, they engaged very early on in sort of the conversations around how their use of the atrium space, for instance, would work, or how they imagined that working for their staff in terms of different parts of the building. And so there was quite an extensive number of alterations and changes they requested that we were able to incorporate into the building as we went on with the build, without it being sort of wasteful, if you like, of pieces. But on the whole, the way they're using the building is very sympathetic, I think, to what the building supports. You know, the change in the atrium took it from a very sterile space that was sort of glazed off on every floor to an open, you know, courtyard almost that they've woven into the way they want to circulate through the building. So they've added staircases and they've put an auditorium at the base of it and things like that.
So there was quite a good interaction between what they wanted as an occupier. You've got the certainty that they're going to be there for many years, so you can make it fit their needs.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, that's the beauty of taking a pre-let, is that you've got the opportunity to influence how the building's going to work for you.
And did they engage with the design team in terms of how it was going to work from a servicing perspective and ultimately an operational carbon?
Well, I think they've embraced the same, you know, the carbon story that started with the base building they have embraced, and I think is carrying on through. You know, we've achieved BREEAM outstanding with the base build. I think that's what they're targeting with the fit out. And then the point about neighbours in terms of then how once they're in occupation, how they continue to monitor the use of energy and tune the systems, if you like. To be as efficient as possible.
They've bought into that whole process.
I think in principle.
Yeah, and to that point, British Land will manage the building for them, and we can tune it and tweak it the systems as we need to, in response to the feedback that they're getting on energy usage. So we'll look back every 3 months or 6 months or 12 months at what the performance of the building was, and we can make adjustments to refine it for them, as opposed to just stopping at the point of practical completion and saying, over to you.
There you go, do what you like.
Which is the problem with BREEAM.
Yes.
You know, it just takes you to that point as a shell and core building.
Yeah.
You could just sort of leave it at that point
Yeah.
and go, right, well, we've done our job.
Yeah, definitely.
And
So I'm assuming that throughout the whole process, you were refining your understanding of the carbon characteristics of this building.
yeah.
That's a sort of constantly ongoing process. How did that influence? Can you give us any examples of how that influenced the design of the building?
Well, we were, I think, working through, there were the obvious parts of understanding, well, what are we doing structurally? What are, lighter structure, more efficient structure? Originally, we were aiming to do all the column strengthening with carbon fibre wraps. There were problems we found with some of the existing structure that meant in places we couldn't do that, so that had to change. But then I think that, a key part of that story was the approach to the façade, which I think right at the outset probably of the project, the assumption would be that most of the façade envelope would have to be replaced to achieve performance that would match what was expected for the new building. But as it evolved, it became apparent that, you didn't have to throw all that away. A lot of that skin, 3,000 square meters of that façade, we were able to remove, dismantle, refurbish relatively simply in the UK, didn't have to take it back to Germany or Holland, and put it back on the building.
People would be interested to know, what did they actually change about it that improved its performance, brought it up to standard?
We physically changed the double glaze units, which are the inner layer of the two skins I was talking about, because those have a lifetime of about 20 years, and then the edge seals start failing. So that would happen pretty much on any window of that age. And then we changed the rubber strips, basically, that sort of held those in place. But all the metal, all of the bracketry, all the framing system is the same.
It didn't need to become thicker, or the insulation panels, they needed to be...
some localised enhancement of insulation, but it's essentially a fully glazed building with the two skins.
It's a really interesting point, because again, when we're looking at refurbishments, especially on a building that's over 20 years old, your first kind of port of call is to take the facade off and assume that that's going to be recycled, but not upcycled. And this was the first time that we'd taken a true circular economy approach to dealing with facades or dealing with any part of the building. So not only were we taking the facade away, refurbishing it and putting it back, it was also creating localised jobs. A pop-up factory was set up in Essex to refurbish the material that went back on the building. And it's not just a carbon story, but there's an economic story that goes with that as well.
And were there other elements of the building that you could take that circular economy approach to?
There was a lot of recycling that went on within the building, so 99% of the building of the material that came out of the building was recycled, if it wasn't reused back inside the building. But the facade was the primary element that we were able to do that with. But having gone through the process with the existing, the original facade manufacturer who helped us to achieve that in the first place, it's something that we're taking forwards as part of the carbon strategy, looking at other buildings in the future.
I suppose we are turning our attention as an industry now more to the embodied carbon within buildings, as we're driving down the operational energy that are needed to run them, or the carbon that's associated with that energy because of the decarbonisation of the grid. We've now got to turn our attention much more to those things that we didn't really take into consideration, or certainly we didn't weigh them as heavily in the overall kind of concept of the building. You've done some assessments, I know, on the operational and embodied energy of the building over a 20-year time frame. Is that just associated with the length of the let, or is it to do with the replacement strategy on the MEP installations? Why do you make the assessment over 20 years?
No, I think that's a good question. I mean, you're right. It coincides both with the length of the lease, and that's a pretty typical period for a commercial lease, but it also does align with the general life expectancy of the primary pieces of plant, the lift and so on. So there is a point in time when you would naturally expect those pieces of equipment to be upgraded or replaced. Part of the reason it's that time frame is by then, you know, the technology's moved on another significant step. You know, the equipment we're putting into the building now is massively more efficient in energy terms than the equipment it's replacing.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's a good period to use. I think it's been quite hard to work out what are the right benchmarks. You know, we don't have a standardized set of benchmarks across the industry, really, for doing a comparison against, you know, what is a typical building. So what we used on this project was we looked at what a typical British Land new build building would be, which, you know, Arup have done a lot of over the years, and we know very well in terms of performance and what they require. That was most useful to British Land, so they could reference that. Yeah. And then we've also used a REEB standard building as well as a way of benchmarking it. But we're trying to be as transparent as we can in terms of how we talk about the numbers, so that actually with the wider industry we can try and get aligned on what we think are the right references.
Yeah. What are the right increments that we ought to be trying to...
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges is MEP equipment actually just doesn't really have a set of sort of published data over the embodied carbon side of it. It's almost treated as though it's just, you weigh it and it's sort of about the steel content. Whereas the structural and the fabric side there's a lot more data now available. That data is growing, it's becoming more standardized. Now it needs to get embedded into sort of, you know, benchmarks that people, you know, target and aim at.
Yeah, so we're looking at embodied in a much more robust way.
Yeah.
Yeah. And has this project and your experiences with it, has it influenced new projects that are coming forwards in your portfolio?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, come back to the point about when you're looking at an existing building that's come to the end of its useful life, and you've got to reimagine it. And I think we'll take a lot more confidence that there's a very solid way forward with reusing buildings and refurbishing them than just automatically returning to the point about new build. I think the other piece is the fact that because we've been able to secure 20-25 year warranties and guarantees on lots of the componentry, including the façade in this building, we know that this building will continue to be attractive to occupiers that want to sign up for long leases, and also institutional investors that are looking to invest.
So that's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for coming to talk to us about it, and hopefully it's a strategy that we can all take forwards into the future and utilise the carbon reductions that are arising from it. So thanks very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.